Right, apologies for the late video, but better now than never, rather. So let's talk about the reality of statecraft. Now, when you think about running a country, basically managing a state, it's often easy to get caught up in your ideology, your beliefs on what should be, how things ought to be. But, plain and simply, that is not practical for reality. See, states cannot function on ideology alone. There's a lot of things to consider. Logistics, population, trade, negotiations. Basically, how does your state react to the world and manage said reactions to ensure the best outcomes for itself and its people? If your ideology says to do one thing, but that is impractical with your current situation, it is often better to go against ideology rather than basically put yourself into a quagmire. Consistency does matter, don't get me wrong, but often people will find that acting according to pragmatism will work a whole lot better at ensuring the betterment of their futures than an ideological position. It's easy to say, oh, well, I believe this, therefore this. It's a lot different to say what is the best situation for us to get out of this, and how do we achieve that situation. And so, you make alliances and take actions. Said alliances and actions are often made within the context of national interests. For example, the United States and Israel. Does the United States agree with everything Israel does? No. But when it comes to the Middle East, it's better to have allies within than without. And so places like Turkey, Israel, to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia, though we do depend on them for oil, are constantly cooperated with despite not caring for them in terms of ideology. Israel probably being the closest to the United States in terms of ideology, and even then they have some disagreements with the US, particularly in regards to the Gaza issue. Turkey is far more dictatorial, and Saudi Arabia is, well, Saudi Arabia. But, fundamentally, national interests say we need allies in the Middle East, especially given the oil-rich nature of the area, and so, alliances, cooperation, treaties, and other actions are made within that context. Saudi for oil, Israel just because we need a good position, and Turkey as a NATO member and to hold the Bosphorus Strait, which is at the edge of the Middle East. It doesn't mean that we like everything they do. For example, Turkish oppression of the Kurds. But it does mean that we make agreements because we understand, within the context of American national interests, we should do certain things, even if we disagree with the people we have to work with to achieve said things. And so, actions are taken. Realpolitik, essentially. And of course, then there's hostile states. They do not just cease their hostility when you would de-escalate. Just because you scale down your forces does not mean they do as well. In fact, oftentimes it's a prisoner's dilemma where the best actual outcome the best actual outcome for any individual is to have the other de-escalate while they don't, because then they can take advantage of the difference in power and basically sweep in. Hostile states don't just stop being hostile because you attempt to de-escalate and negotiate. We especially see this again in the Middle East, though East Asia is another good example with North Korea and the People's Republic. They do not just back down. They're still trying to expand their influence, their position, and their station. They are not going to, fundamentally, change their position, because they still have their same interests. North Korea still wants power and to be recognized as the only legitimate Korea. The PRC still wants influence throughout the globe, and they will do what they can to achieve it. The Iranian state will, of course, protect its own interests, as will the Taliban in Afghanistan. They act accordingly to achieve their goals. Them being hostile does not suddenly cease because you attempt to negotiate with them. Instead, what will happen is they'll take advantage, as the Taliban have regularly done, and as the Iranians have done. Try to de-escalate, they stay militarized and ready to kill the US if they get the opportunity. That's just how they are. And so, actions must be made accordingly. Hostile state will either stop when A, negotiations yield better results than hostility, B, ideology firmly aligns the two, mostly due to regime change, it's not likely to be a peaceful transfer, Or 3, they're taken off the board and replaced. Rarely is it another option. And of course, there is a 4th technical one of just it's getting too expensive. But usually by then, another of the 3 will come along because, plain and simply, if your state is so weak it cannot maintain its current position and relative grandstanding, then usually it's one step away from collapse, like the Soviet Union. And then there's the matter of a balance of power. When there is a type of balance of power, those in the lead will attempt to jockey for their own power to increase. Take the post-Napoleonic War situation with the Treaty of Vienna. After the negotiations at the Congress, and sorry for the noise, after the negotiations at the Congress of Vienna, the European powers redrew the borders, redrew the map under the basis of balance of power. What did every single great power do after that balance of power was set? They sought to expand it. Prussia did it with their customs union over Germany. Austria did it in Italy by attempting to expand their sphere, along with influencing the Turks in the Balkans. France did it in Algeria and several other places across Africa and Asia. The UK did it basically everywhere. That's just kind of what they did at the time. Russia, of course, played the great game in Asia. Spain, it was kind of just declining throughout its entire existence. And of course, people on the sidelines, like the United States, set for continual expansion. Those leading powers, the US, for example, in the Americas, Britain in India, Russia in Northern Asia, they all made their moves to expand their power. Why? Because that's what you do. You want more influence. And when the balance of power is roughly even if it's close, let's say you're 10% weaker than some other guy, but you're close enough that you think you can reach it, you're going to take actions to destabilize that balance of power and put it in your favor. The scale will weigh, and wherever it tips, that's the one with the upper hand. And so when there's a balance of power, you try to get the scales roughly even. Someone will always try to tip it to one side or the other. The only way to really stop this is to have it so firmly in one direction, so firmly and clearly established who is in charge, that the point for jockeying for power is not to resist, but to cooperate with the leading power. Because otherwise, people will just push for their own interests. And of course, destroy a lot of things in the process, trying to push for their own short-term interests to break the balance. And then, of course, finally, there are rarely strictly beneficial actions. It's best to always assume a give-and-take relationship. Think about it. When you want to build a road, that investment isn't going to other parts of your economy. It isn't going to your industry, your resources, or anything else. And it isn't going to other things to help your country. It's going to the roads. If you want to do any investment, that's true. The Dutch especially faced this, where a lot of their investments went to the East Indies. Why? Because it was profitable for them. But it meant their industrialization was slower. They grew their economy less than the Belgians, who, keep in mind, the Belgians before the Congo had barely anything in terms of power. Like, actual territory, it was really just modern Belgium minus a few territories they took from Germany. After the London Peace Conference, which basically solidified its borders. Up until the Congo, Belgium was still wealthier than the Netherlands, generally speaking, because it was investing in itself, while the Netherlands was investing in the Dutch East Indies because, well, that was profitable. So they didn't industrialize, unlike the Belgians did. The Belgians were focusing on themselves. They invested in themselves, and so they boosted their GDP, while simultaneously the Dutch boosted the GDP of the Dutch East Indies. Don't get me wrong, it had its benefits, especially when it came to rubber production later on. But as stated, it's a give and take. In exchange for that massive increase in rubber production, they gave up their industrialization. It took them a longer time to do so. That's just how it is. Same with the United States and a lot of its negotiations. Rarely can the US just get a flat good deal. It has to give, and it has to take. Unless you want it to just be a take, which requires military force. Things like the EU even have their benefits and costs. Naturally, sovereignty is a big one when it comes to the costs of the European Union, while it benefits from standardization and trade between countries that are far less shall we say, ideologically opposed and bureaucratically clashing because everything's stabilized, more or less. Whenever it comes to building a state, maintaining a state, or expanding its interests, you're never going to find, or rather, you're rarely going to find just a purely beneficial thing. Banning slavery. Beneficial just outright. Sure, it took some transitioning, and you could argue that's the negative, but the end of slavery itself was just a better economic move in terms of effectiveness of labor. Pure labor efficiency was up after slavery was abolished. And, generally speaking, it made people richer. It just was better for people. But very rarely will you have such easy black and white choices. Most of the time, it's gives and takes. Losing money to gain something, losing favor to do this, costing soldiers' lives to achieve a goal. The state rarely is free. It has to spend things to get things. It has to make trades and deals. It acts as just a player. And so whenever you think of statecraft and you look at a politician like, why aren't they sticking to ideology? Why aren't they doing this or that? A lot of the time, it's pragmatism. Or they're getting paid. Pretty much the only two good explanations for most decisions is this person is either thinking of the long term, or, you could argue more likely, they're getting paid for it. Really, that's kind of the only two big options that we have. Tying people down to ideology is very rare, especially in politics. But when it comes to statecraft, that's honestly a good thing. If you tie yourself too closely to a single ideology, it doesn't have to be necessarily wrong, just too closely and too zealously. Oftentimes that'll backfire, since if ideology says to do X when Y is preferred to get an outcome, well, then you're going to do X. And that is not the best choice. The state is not some doll you can dress up in whatever ideology you want. You can't dress it up in traditionalism, liberalism, libertarianism, etc., and expect it to go completely perfectly. That's just reality. So you must dress it up according to what's necessary and what is practical. You can have your own ideological flair for what you think is best, but fundamentally, when it comes to the state and how you manage it, or create it, or continue it, naturally, you gotta think pragmatically. You can't stall things like that. You have to act accordingly. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.